They really thought they could control the Brits. Not influence them, not persuade them, control them. And what makes this even crazier is that, at the time, a lot of Americans were absolutely convinced it would work. They spoke with confidence, acted with authority, and moved like history was already on their side. But what happened next didn't just surprise Britain, it quietly exposed one of the most awkward miscalculations in modern cultural history. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Because when Americans believe they're right, they don't just believe it. They assume everyone else will eventually agree. And Britain? Britain did not agree. To understand how things got this strange, you have to go back to the mindset. America didn't just grow into a global power. It burst onto the world stage with momentum, money, and a deep belief that confidence equals leadership. After winning wars, shaping global media, exporting culture, and setting economic rules, many Americans slowly absorbed an idea that felt natural to them. If it works in the US, it must work everywhere else too. And nowhere did that assumption feel more tempting than with Britain. Same language, shared history, military allies, similar institutions, familiar accents. On paper, it felt like a cousin relationship, close enough that guidance could turn into authority, advice into direction, influence into control. But this is where everything started going wrong. Because Americans often misunderstood one critical thing about the British mindset. Politeness is not submission. Silence is not agreement. And calmness does not mean weakness. Early warning signs were everywhere. American politicians, media commentators, and corporate leaders routinely spoke about Britain rather than with Britain. They explained British politics to Brits. They interpreted British culture on behalf of the British. They even framed British resistance as confusion rather than disagreement. And Brits noticed. They always notice. What made this belief spiral out of control was America's growing confidence during moments when Britain appeared to be struggling. Economic shifts, political instability, post-empire identity questions. From the outside, it looked like a nation unsure of itself. To American observers, this looked like an opening. This is where the tone shifted. Suddenly, advice became pressure. Suggestions became expectations. Media narratives subtly suggested Britain needed to be modernized, guided, or corrected. And the assumption was simple. Britain would eventually fall in line because that's what sensible allies do, right? Wrong. Because Britain doesn't respond to dominance the way Americans expect. British resistance rarely comes as confrontation. It comes as delay, as quiet defiance, as dry humor that sounds harmless but lands like a warning shot. And Americans missed it every single time. One of the most underestimated moments came when American confidence collided directly with British independence. In decision-making, Americans believed shared values meant shared outcomes, but the Brits believed shared values meant shared respect, not shared obedience. So when pressure was applied, Britain didn't explode. It didn't shout, it didn't storm off, it simply didn't comply. And that confused Americans deeply. From American media panels to political discussions, you could hear it in the language. Why won't they just do the obvious thing? What's stopping them? They're being irrational. But the truth was far simpler and far more uncomfortable. Britain didn't like being told what to do, especially by someone who thought politeness meant permission. This tension wasn't just political. It bled into culture, business, and everyday interactions. American executives entered British spaces assuming authority. American commentators framed British reactions as outdated. American tourists spoke louder, slower, and more confidently, believing clarity would win compliance. And each time, the British response was the same: calm, controlled, and quietly dismissive. This is where Americans made their biggest mistake. They assumed British calm meant they were winning. But calm is Britain's default posture. Understatement is their armor. And sarcasm? Sarcasm is the final warning. There were moments when Americans genuinely believed Britain had no alternative but to follow their lead. Global dominance has a way of blinding you to the idea that someone might choose inconvenience over obedience. And Britain chose inconvenience, repeatedly. What shocked Americans most wasn't resistance. It was the lack of drama. There was no grand speech, no public meltdown, no open hostility, just firm decisions and polite refusal. Behind closed doors, British officials, leaders, and institutions made it clear they would not be managed. Not culturally, not politically, not strategically, and certainly not emotionally. The irony is that Americans genuinely thought they were helping. They believed leadership was universal. That confidence was contagious. That success granted authority beyond borders. But Britain didn't see confidence. They saw assumption. They didn't see leadership. They saw impatience. And once that realization set in, it was already too late. The belief that Americans could control Britain collapsed slowly, painfully, and mostly in private. There was no single moment of defeat, just a series of quiet realizations that influence has limits, even between allies. What made it sting even more was that Britain didn't gloat. They didn't mock openly. They didn't celebrate. They simply carried on. And that might be the most British response of all. Looking back, it's almost surreal how certain Americans once were. The confidence, the certainty, the assumption that shared language meant shared thinking, that history meant loyalty, that power meant permission. But Britain never signed up to be managed. And that's the lesson that still lingers today. Because this wasn't about arrogance alone, it was about misunderstanding. A clash between a culture that leads loudly and a culture that resists quietly. Between a nation that believes influence should be visible and one that believes control should never be acknowledged. In the end, Americans didn't fail because they lacked power. They failed because they misread silence as surrender and politeness as agreement. And Britain reminded the world that calm doesn't mean controlled, and history doesn't mean ownership. And that realization still echoes today. Because if there's one thing this story proves, it's this. You can share a language, share a past, share an alliance, and still refuse to be led. And the moment Americans understood that, that's when the belief finally died. Even after Americans realized Britain wouldn't just fall in line, they kept trying. Different era, different leaders, different strategies. Same misplaced confidence. Every time, the result was the same: polite resistance, subtle irony, and decisions made quietly out of reach. Take trade negotiations, for example. Americans approached them like a chessboard they already controlled, assuming their moves were obvious, logical, inevitable. And the Brits? They played the game differently. Not aggressively, not rudely, just with patience. Waiting, watching. Smiling politely while quietly reshaping the board in their favor. Every so-called American win was carefully calibrated to appear as compliance, when in reality it was compromise, a word that sounds friendly but often hides refusal. Then there's culture. Americans exported media, music, politics, and fashion, assuming that influence equals authority. But Brits absorbed, adapted, and often quietly subverted. A trendy American idea might arrive in London expecting to dominate the conversation, only to return home a month later, slightly altered, slightly mocking, completely British. It wasn't rebellion, it was mastery, masked as civility. And humor? Humor became the weapon Americans never saw coming. A dry remark, a sarcastic comment, a polite joke, each one a reminder that control wasn't theirs. Americans laughed nervously, thinking they understood the joke, only to realize the punchline was about them. Overconfidence collided with understatement, and the result was often humiliation without even realizing it. So, what's the takeaway from these crazy moments in history? It's simple. Authority isn't universal. Influence isn't automatic. Confidence without understanding is often misread as ignorance, and polite, calm resistance can be far more effective than any dramatic confrontation. Americans thought they could control the Brits, and in a way, they tried, with politics, with culture, with persuasion, even with charm. But the Brits proved that control is an illusion when the other side values independence above all. And sometimes, the quietest defiance is the loudest statement of all. So next time you hear about Americans trying to lead, teach, or explain, just remember, calm doesn't mean compliant. Politeness doesn't mean permission. And under every composed exterior, history has already made its choice. Because the Brits, they never signed up to be controlled. And they never will.